As a franchise, Indiana Jones has always been a bit of a roller coaster when it comes to its quality. From great to different, then great again to whatever this was. At the very least, it wasn't scared of taking chances and trying something a little bit different, even if it didn't always work. The same could be said for its games too, so let's take a look at what's considered by many to be the best the series has to offer. Oh, and suffice to say, there will be spoilers for a 30-year-old game, as we'll be looking at the story and solutions alike. Originally released in '92 by LucasArts, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis was released again nearly a year later, this time as the Toolkey edition, which is to say that it featured voiceovers.
It's pointing at Sophia's necklace.
This is the same version powered by Scum that I got off of Steam, so with all that being said, like, comment and subscribe to the channel for more content, and let's dive right into it. The game starts off with a moody blue background and the iconic Indiana Jones title popping up, accompanied with the theme song in deliciously crusty MIDI format. Then the titular Dr. Jones swings through a window, breaking and entering into the very same college that he works in. I guess they must have lost the keys to the attic. From here, you get to click around, explore and examine different objects with Jones dialoguing about stuff, all before falling down several stories and being sent on your ass multiple times.
Oof.
From the get-go, the game's establishing the borderline silly yet serious tone of adventure we've got in store for ourselves. After finally tracking down the idol we were looking for, Indy heads back to his office to meet up with Marcus and the totally legit Mr. Smith. A bit of a back and forth over the authenticity of the statue is given before the MacGuffin is nicked at gunpoint as Mr. Smith makes a getaway, albeit not before we get a couple of good smacks in and steal his coat. No thanks to Marcus, by the way, who just stands there and lets Indy get on with it. Thanks, Marcus. In any case, this results in the not at all surprising twist that Mr. Smith is in fact Klaus Kerner, a spy from the Third Reich. Along with his passport, we find a pamphlet detailing the Jastrow expedition that Indy was a part of, along with his assistant at the time, Sophia Hapgood, a once promising archaeology student that decided to bugger off and become a psychic of all things.
To become a psychic.
How odd. Figuring that's Kerner's next target, it's off to New York City to have a word with her. Albeit only after being introduced to the piss-poor combat system that takes me a solid 15 minutes to figure out, even after consulting the manual, but we'll get back to the awful fighting in a bit. For now, it's chatting with Sophia after realizing that Kerner's already beat us here and ransacked the place, which is a bit surprising since he obviously went to the tailor to pick up a second coat, but okay. At the very least, he missed the orichalcum bead in Sophia's desk, which demonstrates its power of the Atlantean artifact of Sophia's necklace that belongs to her spirit guide, Nurab Sal. Who she claims bids that we find the lost dialogue of Plato, which should describe the way of reaching Atlantis itself.
Nurab Sal speaks. He bids us find the... what? Oh, a book, yes. The lost dialogue of
Whilst
Plato.
Indy is forever skeptical, despite this being said after the events of the movies, he insists that it's a hoax. I guess when you're a skeptic, you always stay a skeptic. It's only when Madame Hapgood suggests that the baddies may have already found a copy that he begrudgingly agrees to go along with it. From here, we'll be doing more clicking on things, combining our collection of verbs with nouns throughout the world to build up our inventory, speak with NPCs, and solve a variety of puzzles to advance the plot. We even get treated to the iconic road map straight out of the movies, as we have a few places to pick from and some peculiar characters to speak to. Starting off with some bushwhacking in Tikal and interrogating a goddamn parrot of all things to learn the title of Plato's dialogue, we're permitted to enter the temple from the shady bloke running a souvenir stand outside. This just screams reputable scholar to me. Once inside, this is where I met my first asinine roadblock, scanning the background to find the spiral pattern that was slightly different to all the others. After trying and failing everything I could think of for about half an hour, I finally decide to walk outside and nick his lantern while Sophia has him distracted. Of course, why didn't I think of that sooner? For some reason, Sternhart's fine with me having his lantern now, despite throwing a fit earlier, and we finally get to open, use, pick up, use the spiral to make, I shit you not, an elephant's trunk and pull it to open a secret chamber. After all that, Sternheart nicks the World Stone from the tomb and casually chad strides out of a secret exit, whilst Indy and Sophia half-heartedly chase behind him and decide, yep, he's gotten away alright. If only you two moved with any sense of urgency at all, but I guess running sprites just aren't in the cards. After getting played and doing some more faffing about in Iceland, we then have Sophia chat up some old git into doing business, where we finally learn that the Hitchhiker's Guide to Atlantis is contained in some collection. Perhaps uniquely for its time, Fate of Atlantis is an adventure game with somewhat randomized puzzles, and we're about to hit our first example of it. The book can actually be found in one of 3 places within Burnett College, depending on the name of the collection that we've been given. Now, while this is a nice bit of replayability added to even the opening act, the solution for all 3 places it could be are all varying degrees of absurdist mind screw. Whether that be sticking a wad of gum to your shoes for traction so you can climb a coal chute, using mayonnaise from your office as a makeshift oil to slide a totem pole, or making your own screwdriver out of a piece of cloth and arrowhead. Oh, and a prime example of the pedantic puzzle solving is how the game wants you to use your screwdriver on each individual screw 6 separate times. Just why? This doesn't add anything to the experience, it's just busy work. It could be pretty asinine later too, like being extremely picky about letting you do the correct solution if you aren't clicking on the right spot. Siphoning fuel from a truck, for example, wouldn't let me put the fuel into this clay jar until I clicked on the end of the hose instead of the hose itself. Anyway, once you've discovered the hiding place for the MacGuffin, be ready to do a lot of reading and maybe take some notes, since you'll be referring to the contents and clues in the lost dialogue a whole lot throughout the game. The contents are also random for each playthrough too, so the solutions it can hint towards can be pretty different, which honestly I rather liked having to do some research and keep these notes in mind for when they inevitably became relevant later. It's also at this point that the main standout feature for the Fate of Atlantis is introduced. After bullying Indy with more medium hokum, Sophia eventually manages to get him to sit still and tell him his fortune. This is when the choice to pick between one of 3 separate paths becomes available, with each option wildly changing the pacing, tone, and way you'll be solving your issues throughout the middle part of the game. The choices being teaming up with Sophia to figure things out together, go it alone and have Indy use his wits to figure things out by himself, or rely on your fists to 1v1 both Nazi stooges as well as the fighting controls themselves. I suppose it's about time we talked about the fighting mechanics real quick. It's by far and away the most clunky part of the game, and in theory, with keyboard fighting enabled, you're meant to be able to move back, then attack or block high, medium, and low when you press 9, 6, and 3 on the numpad, for example. Except the keys are dependent on which way you're facing, so it can get pretty confusing. In practice, however, I spent ages trying to get it to work and it simply wouldn't comply no matter what I did, so I ended up getting my ass handed to me by Biff the doorman. Eventually I gave up, switched to mouse controls, aimed for the groin, and generally hoped for the best. I would say it's a shame given how much thought and effort went into the system, but every time I tried to get it working, I felt like I was the one getting dick punched instead, so no thanks. I think I'll pass on messing with the keyboard anymore and stick to M1ing my way through. Which is at least pretty cathartic when it does work. And while I'm aware of the Sucker Punch option, where you hit 0 and you should be able to just one-shot certain enemies, whenever I tried it, Indy would just instead run away, and I don't know why. In any case, no matter which route you choose to take, you'll end up globetrotting through the Mediterranean, tracking down clues to the location of Atlantis, all through differing means and obstacles along the way.
It's pointing at Sophia's necklace. It's a hard rubber comb on a string. The comb's charged with static. It's a static charged comb on a string. Why, it's pointing at me.
This is a really nice feature that was pretty revolutionary for its time. Even the fifth path I ended up enjoying despite its shortcomings in regards to how well the combat and I got along. I do seriously advise that you save often when playing though, since getting your ass beat results in a game over. Fate of Atlantis uses the same general locations, but they're all different depending on which path you undergo. Like Algier being a bit more involved when you have Sophia with you, otherwise having the streets be clear when journeying there on your own. Likewise, there are some parts that are completely omitted, like getting caught up in a car chase in France when Trottier refuses to take Jones's warnings of danger seriously.
On my dead fingers. Help me, Dr. Jones! You know, it would serve him right if I let him go. But I hate those Nazis.
Granted, the car chase itself is pretty bare bones, and I somehow managed to even get stuck in place when all you do is click to move. This almost resulted in me having to reload from my last save since I just couldn't move, but the Germans at least crashed into me, which seemed to have fixed it. It's also worth mentioning real quick that this reminded me of the Demolition Derby section of Full Throttle, another LucasArts title that came out a few years later, and it has me wondering if this somehow influenced it. Unfortunately, after this exciting car chase, the downside is that you now have to walk around reading street signs for the right place where Trottier yeeted the stone disc I'm looking for, which honestly just serves to waste the player's time in busy work. The same trial and error exploration goes the same for when you get to Crete, where you have to go into all these empty buildings looking for the one room that's randomly selected to have this giant mural showing you what to do with a couple of statues and the surveyor's equipment that you've got. Only there's about a dozen crumbling ruins that the statues can be under, then when you do finally line them up, the game can be pretty finicky when it comes to clicking on the right thing. After that, you're then treated to a literal maze since you're on the Isle of Crete, and have to wander around this labyrinth to figure out where to go next in your adventure.
Phew, a Stone Age weapon for a Stone Age guy.
Depending on which path you choose though, you can tackle this area pretty differently, or entirely skip it in one playthrough, getting a free ticket to your destination instead, which is pretty sweet. By the time you reach the third act, the pathways all converge back together and play out mostly the same way, having you gain entrance to Atlantis and then exploring it within its layout of 3 concentric circles. I do have to say that I like the attention to detail they paid whenever you're in the dark, as it'll be near pitch black at first before slowly getting brighter until Indy can kinda see, at least enough to let you figure out a better light source. It's a really nice detail to include the few times it shows up. If you thought the labyrinth on Crete was bad though, you haven't seen anything until you get to Atlantis. The entire place is a literal maze with rooms you can enter labeled as question marks until you step inside. And even then, the generic rooms have shortcuts in them and all look the same. There's also a lot of items to pick up and use here, and it could be easy to either miss them or forget to pick them up again once you've used them in the first place. So I spent ages trying to figure out how to cross the cavern, only to remember I left my ladder at the very first room, which meant backtracking all the way over there, and there's respawning guards in every quadrant, so it could be pretty tedious. The same goes for if you run out of orichalcum, the little orange beads that you use to power everything here, since you now have a means of making your own supply. That involves a pretty simple but time-intensive process of going to several areas and operating a huge machine to churn out more. So if you waste all your beads trying to brute force your way through the puzzles here, you're gonna have to go all the way back to fetch more. Oh, and Indy also remembers to pick up the stone discs whenever you use them as a key to enter new areas, except for Atlantis itself when rapid onset dementia hits him. What I'm trying to get at is please save yourself a headache and clean up after yourself. Now while it may sound like I'm being overly negative, there are a lot of fun puzzles and elements of the story that I greatly enjoyed. Like Indy MacGyvering his own hot air balloon out of some old knickknacks that he then fills up in a natural geyser. Also, he could take part in a minigame of landing near a moving U-boat, climbing aboard, knocking out the guard, dressing up in disguise, and committing some subterfuge. I have to admit that commanding the entire crew to the torpedo bay in his American accent is a little strange though.
Now hear this. All hands to the stern torpedo bay.
Plus, he unhelpfully reads the controls to the U-boat in German instead of translating them despite knowing German himself.
It's labeled Ausgeschnitzel.
Indy, you absolute git. You know what Ausgeschnitzel means. Stop holding out on me.
It's labeled Krauske-Farben.
Speaking of which, the voice acting as a whole is pretty good, especially considering it was done back in '92. The main duo of Indy and Sophia stand out in particular, and despite being voiced by stand-in Doug Lee and not Harrison Ford, Lee puts on a great performance. He sounds the part without having to be an exact one-to-one replacement for the OG Ford.
Yet you stole things from my expedition. Artifacts such as archaeology has never seen. You're lucky I don't have you arrested.
Meanwhile, Sophia sells her part as the sidekick and doesn't let up the chance of owning Indy in every conversation she gets the chance to.
Indiana? Sounds like the name of one of your states, or possibly a cat.
Actually, it was the name of a dog.
Sophia.
Listening to these two banter throughout the team's path is a delightful experience, even if it leads to moments of having to outright bully Sophia to get anything done. Like pushing her into volunteering for a knife thrower, or brute forcing conversation options, until she finally agrees to not starve to death in some cave and instead climb through a hole that Indy can't reach.
You don't fool me, Jones. You're the one who's scared of snakes.
So what if I am?
So you admit it. Ah, we're really not going anywhere until I crawl through there, are we?
Afraid not.
She can be a little annoying in how ungrateful she is at times, which, on the one hand, helps her come across as being a more believable character, but on the other, she refuses to free herself whilst Indy holds open this bronze gate.
Find out.
As I said, the voice acting as a whole is pretty good, but some of the side characters are pretty silly, like Bjorn Heimdall.
Puppycup, you know what actually stopped them, John?
Maybe they didn't allot any time on their itinerary.
No. They were stopped by a force field put here by beings not of this earth.
My favorite has to be Al-Jabbar though, whose character varies wildly depending on which route you speak to him in, from helpful to hostile to an absolute troll.
You've returned alive. Tell me, how was your trip?
It was going pretty well until our camels died.
Then there's the fact that the main baddies are pretty much cartoon caricatures.
You fool! You come back to show me this prehistoric knick-knack?
Herr Doctor, I believe this knick-knack, as you call it, comes from the lost city.
Then we have failed!
Which, to be fair, I suppose makes perfect sense within the Jones setting as a whole, but it does make part of me wonder how well it would be received if it was done nowadays. Oh, and as it turns out, I must have voiced Dr. Uberman myself in another timeline.
Kerner, have you seen Dr. Jones's assistant? She's dummy thick.
Jokes aside, the pixel art is actually pretty good, especially for 92. The backgrounds in particular are gorgeous and do a lot to help convey the feeling of a globe-trotting Indiana Jones adventure. The characters are nicely animated, especially when it comes to Indy climbing up behind a waterfall.
Wait
This
here.
water effect is actually pretty impressively done and stood out in particular for how smooth it is. The rare character close-ups we're treated to also hold up pretty nicely. The feeling of the story is helped out by the music too, which outside of the main theme isn't composed by John Williams. But still, they do a great job at heightening the mood and ambience whenever it's present. The only two standout exceptions I can think of would have to be the jungle ambience in Tikal, where it made it really hard to concentrate from how loud it was. Then again, to a lesser degree, when it came to operating the hulking beast towards the end of the game, playing this short, repetitive song that made me want to get off Mr. Bones' wild ride all that much sooner, rather than simply from any sense of urgency from being in actual danger. There's a couple of endings to achieve, depending on your actions throughout the adventure, and there's even earlier game overs if you either suck at the super janky fighting mechanics, or torch smack to the wrong mook. This caught me off guard that someone actually has the sense to just shoot Indy when they have the chance. You're even given a little lore snippet about what happens depending on who offs you, like the hardest enemy in the game going on to become an opera singer after he two-hit kills you. You know, like you do. I mean, just look at this guy's health bar, it's touching the edge of the screen. And while it is possible to beat him, the developers mercifully included an alternative to fighting him. Appropriately, the story ramps up and builds towards a fitting climax between you and the big bads, although you have to be careful when navigating the conversation here, since one slip up means getting a game over, as it's full of pitfalls to trip up and talk yourself into getting ceremoniously killed. Also, I really don't get why they decided to throw this maze of Scooby-Doo doors in as the penultimate puzzle to the game. Did they really need to tack on another 5 to 10 minutes of trial and error gameplay? Once again, you can save at any time, even during conversations, so it just serves to waste the player's time or incentivize save scumming. My only guess is that they wanted you to get stuck here long enough that you'll notice the clue to the final puzzle is around here somewhere. Speaking of the pixel art again, it's absolutely gorgeous in Atlantis, and especially here, with these statues pouring out molten lava looking pretty sick that you'll hopefully overlook the fact that Indy should be burning up going anywhere near this lava bed. Well, to be fair, this is set after the trilogy, so clearly it's just a side effect of the Grail. I've got nothing. With everything said and done, I would honestly love to see a remaster treatment similar to the Full Throttle given to the Fate of Atlantis. The story is pretty bog-standard Indiana Jones affair, but it's executed so well with the branching stories, mostly enjoyable puzzle solving, and memorable if a bit goofy characters. If they just made a few improvements to the fighting mechanics and did some tweaks here and there, I think it'd come out looking pretty good. Even as it is, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is still a fantastic adventure and a great way to spend 8 or more hours of your time. It's a solid experience. The amount of replay value it has on offer is pretty impressive, especially for a game of its time, and even having a few things become clear on repeat playthroughs, further incentivizing you to go back and try it again. It may be a little jank in places, but it has its charm and merit where it counts, and it stands up even today. You can pick it up on Steam or Good Old Games for cheap, and without having any issues getting it to run properly. Even despite my grievances with the combat system, maze-like sections, and a few what moments in regards to the puzzles, Fate of Atlantis is a genuinely fantastic experience. It's absolutely worth playing for any indie or adventure fans out there, and I can't recommend it enough. As always, cheers for sticking around, and I'll see you all next time where we'll be setting phasers to frag. Until then, keep on smiling, and I'll see you all in the next video. Oh, and remember,
Funnels are what you pour liquids into.